In early 1977, an unknown assailant targeted three couples in secluded areas, resulting in three deaths and three serious injuries. Despite extensive investigations, the perpetrator was never caught, and the events became known as the Atlanta Lovers Lane slayings. The series of attacks began on January 16, 1977, when 26-year-old LeBrian Lovett and 25-year-old Veronica Hill were discovered in a crashed vehicle at an Atlanta intersection. Both were naked and had sustained significant trauma from being struck with multiple rounds. Investigators determined that the couple had been at Adams Park, a known spot for intimate encounters, when an assailant shot them through the windshield. Lovett attempted to drive away but lost control due to his injuries, leading to the crash. Both succumbed to their wounds at the hospital. Less than a month later, on February 12, 1977, 18-year-old Dennis Langston and 17-year-old Detyra Tatum were attacked under similar circumstances in West Manor Park. While they engaged in intimate activities in their car, an assailant approached and fired 6 shots into the vehicle. Both teenagers were injured but survived, and later described the shooter as a tall black male. The final known attack occurred on March 12, 1977, when 20-year-old Diane Collins and her fiancé were in Adams Park after a date. An assailant fired 6 rounds into the passenger side window, ending Collins instantly. Her fiancé sustained a head wound but managed to drive home and call for help. He ultimately survived but was unable to give any meaningful details of the description of the perpetrator. Ballistic tests confirmed that the same .38 caliber weapon was used in all 3 attacks, providing extremely strong circumstantial evidence suggesting a single perpetrator. Investigators noted the intervals between the incidents: 26 days between the first and second, and 28 days between the second and third. This led to a theory that the perpetrator operated on a cyclical schedule. Anticipating another attack, police staked out local parks during the expected time frame in early April, but the assailant didn't reappear. Some have speculated that this increased police presence spooked the man and broke this cycle. The lack of robbery or SA in these cases led authorities to consider alternative motives. One theory suggested that the perpetrator harbored animosity toward couples engaging in intimate activities in public spaces, possibly viewing such behavior as immoral. This perspective aligns with the concept of a quote-unquote moral enforcer, who targets individuals perceived as acting indecently. These sorts of serial perpetrators are thought to believe that society has fallen into a state of decay, and that they can restore order through slaying people they believe are immoral. They justify the disturbing nature of their own actions using some sort of utilitarian calculus where their action produces more good than bad. Personally, I have a hard time seeing the logic there, and I suspect pretty much everyone out there watching feels the same way. Some theorists have attempted to connect the case to the Texarkana moonlight slayings of 1946, which involved a series of unsolved attacks on couples parked in lovers' lanes. These parallels have led some to speculate about a possible connection or a copycat phenomenon, though no evidence has substantiated such claims. However, it doesn't appear that the authorities ever took such a connection seriously, and there's no apparent evidence of any connection beyond very weak circumstantial evidence. After all, lovers' lanes pick up that reputation precisely because they're secluded places where most people wouldn't go at night. These areas provide a quiet place for young couples to have alone time, but unfortunately this is also an ideal hunting ground for predators looking for a lower risk point of attack. Another theory suggests that he simply just enjoyed the sick thrill of destroying the lives of innocent people. Despite these theories, no concrete suspects emerged. The attacks ceased after March 1977, and with no further leads, the case went cold. At this point, over 4 decades have passed since the Atlanta Lovers Lane slayings, and the case remains unsolved. Notably, it looks like updated forensic techniques have never been applied to this case. I should say, though, that it's unclear whether there was even any DNA evidence to collect from the scene given that the perpetrator shot and fled. I think our best hope for resolution in this case is a deathbed confession. Given that he may have seen himself as acting as a quote-unquote moral enforcer, he may have seen the evil nature of his acts in his old age and have a desire to come clean before he expires. In 1988, an unidentified serial perpetrator is believed to have slain at least 9 women and caused the disappearances of 2 others in Massachusetts. This individual has become known to law enforcement and the general public as the New Bedford Highway Killer. The victims were primarily companionship workers struggling with addiction and were discovered along and around major highways, notably Interstate 195 and Route 140. Robin Rhodes, 29, is believed to have gone missing sometime in March or April 1988. She was eventually discovered on March 28, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 140 southbound in Freetown by a search dog. Unlike most of the other women, she was not known to be involved in illicit activities, though she was known to associate with people who were. Rochelle Doparala, 28, disappeared sometime during late April 1988. On December 10, 1988, her body was discovered by people riding ATVs in a gravel pit along Reed Road, about 2 miles from Interstate 195. In May 1988, 25-year-old Deborah Lynn McConnell of Newport was last seen by her father following her mother's funeral. She is considered to be the 3rd victim. A cadaver dog found her body on December 1, 1988, off Massachusetts Route 140 northbound in Freetown. On May 27, 1988, 29-year-old Deborah Medeiros of Fall River was reported missing after a fight with her boyfriend in New Bedford. Although Deborah's boyfriend was initially a person of interest, he was ruled out as a suspect. 19-year-old Christina Montero was last seen sometime in May 1988. She's not been heard from since, though according to authorities she's presumed deceased. It's unclear why authorities believe this. However, given that this is an active, ongoing investigation, evidence is released on a need-to-know basis. Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, 34, was last seen sometime in June 1988 and was reported missing in December 1988. She lived near Christina Montero and, like Montero, remains missing to this day. Also, like Montero, she's presumed deceased with no indication given as to why this is the case. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Paiva of New Bedford was last seen walking home from Whispers Pub on July 7, 1988, following an argument with her boyfriend in the early hours. Her body was found on July 30, 1988, beside Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, lying on her back, with her feet pointed toward the highway. Authorities noted that the staging of her body was similar to how Deborah Medeiros was discovered, suggesting the same perpetrator. Naturally, her boyfriend was initially considered a suspect, but was eventually cleared of all suspicion. On July 11, 1988, 35-year-old Deborah Greenlaw DeMello was last seen in New Bedford. Her body was discovered on November 8, 1988, off the eastbound Reed Road ramp of Interstate 195 by a highway crew. Her clothing was scattered among tree branches, and she was found in possession of some of Nancy Paiva's belongings. 26-year-old Mary Rose Santos, from New Bedford, was dropped off near the downtown bus station on July 16, 1988, by her husband. She was last seen dancing at the old quarterdeck lounge about 5 hours later. Her body was eventually discovered on March 31, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 88 in Westport by 2 boys. Sandra Botello, 24, reportedly left her apartment at 11 p.m. on August 11, 1988, and never returned. She was the final victim to be discovered, found on April 24, 1989, in the woods along Interstate 195 in Marion. On September 4, 1988, 25-year-old Dawn Mendez was last seen leaving her apartment in New Bedford to attend a family christening. Her mostly skeletal remains were discovered on November 29, 1988, on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 by a sniffer dog. The investigation into these slayings was extensive, involving local and state law enforcement agencies. Several suspects were considered, including local attorney Kenneth Ponte, who had represented some of the victims in legal matters. Ponte was indicted for the slaying of one victim, 28-year-old Rochelle Doparala, but the charges were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. Another potential suspect, Anthony DeGrazia, was arrested for a variety of SA activities in the area. While he was out on bail, the authorities stated that he was the prime suspect in the New Bedford slayings. As a result of this, he was either slain, potentially by a loved one of the women, or taken out by his own hand. Notably, the authorities later retracted the statement that he was the quote-unquote prime suspect in this case. Perhaps the most intriguing theory revolves around a European serial perpetrator known as the Lisbon Ripper. Between 1992 and 1993, 3 women in Lisbon were found slain, their bodies bearing signs of vicious attacks. Speculation about a possible connection emerged because both cases involved victims of Portuguese ancestry. Some theorists proposed that the Lisbon Ripper and the New Bedford Highway Killer could be the same individual, supported by the timeline and the supposedly eerily similar victim profiles. Between 1972 and 1973, New York City was terrorized by a series of brutal attacks targeting young boys of Black and Puerto Rican descent. And yeah, just a quick programming note, I'm going to have to censor myself a bit for this section. The chop-off portion of this serial predator's name refers to exactly the worst thing you can think of. The first known victim was 8-year-old Douglas Owens, whose lifeless body was discovered on March 9, 1972, atop a Harlem rooftop. He had been stabbed 38 times, and his body was subject to extreme desecration. This horrific act was soon followed by another attack on April 20, 1972, when a 10-year-old boy was lured away, stabbed multiple times, and subjected to the same disturbing defilement. Miraculously, he survived and provided the police with a description of his attacker: a slender man with medium dark skin, possibly walking with a limp, and having a mole on his left cheek. Despite this eyewitness account, the perpetrator eluded capture. On October 23, 1972, 9-year-old Wendell Hubbard was found on the roof of his East Harlem apartment building. He had been stabbed 17 times, and again his body was subject to desecration. The pattern of these crimes instilled fear throughout the community, as parents grappled with the horrifying reality that a predator was targeting their children. The terror continued into the following year, and on March 6, 1973, 9-year-old Luis Ortiz disappeared while running an errand to a local store. His body was later found in a basement stairwell. He had been stabbed 38 times. The final known victim was 8-year-old Stephen Cropper, whose body was discovered on August 17, 1973, on a Lower East Side rooftop. Unlike the previous victims, Cropper had been slashed with a razor, and there had been no additional defilement. This deviation in the killer's modus operandi puzzled investigators, but was ultimately linked to the same perpetrator due to the similarities in victim profile and location. Also, you'll want to keep the differences in mind, because this is going to become a major factor in whether this mystery is properly unsolved or not. The community's outrage and fear reached a boiling point, leading to public protests and demands for increased police protection. Some members of the community questioned whether adequate resources were being allocated to the investigation. In May 1974, a potential breakthrough occurred when 33-year-old Erno Soto was arrested after attempting to abduct a young boy. Soto, an unemployed former substance addict with a history of mental illness, confessed to the slaying of Stephen Cropper. However, inconsistencies in his statements and his mental instability complicated the case. Notably, officials from Manhattan State Hospital indicated that Soto had been in their custody at the time of some of the slayings. However, it was later revealed that he may have been out on day passes or overnight passes during some or all of the events. Despite the confession, the lack of concrete evidence in Soto's mental condition prevented a definitive conclusion. In December 1976, he was deemed unfit for trial and was recommitted to a mental institution. The slayings ceased following his arrest, leading some investigators to believe he was indeed the perpetrator. However, due to the absence of a trial and conviction, the case remains officially unsolved. Notably, it seems as though investigators were sure that Soto was the perpetrator and simply stopped investigating the crimes. This could have been the perfect opportunity for the actual perpetrator to cease committing said offenses. Also, as you will recall, Soto only confessed to the slaying of Stephen Cropper, whose slaying was missing many of the elements of the other attacks.